Well, hello everyone. I've been travelling a bit, Pennsylvania and Jamaica, and it's been a quite extraordinary couple of weeks. Beautiful in many ways. I went to Pennsylvania to speak in Reading to residents and doctors, and then speak at a conference. What mattered most for me during that conference was being alerted to something I must talk about later on, but we'll touch on briefly at several points in this talk, and that is the incredible addiction to pornography that is happening in teenage boys in particular, and increasingly in girls too, and its consequences. But I'll come back to that in due course. I was nearly in trouble with the family because I had booked a trip to Pennsylvania without realising it clashed with Canadian Thanksgiving. So I didn't get back till Saturday evening, a little tired, but when I got to our house, there were 41 people there. Fortunately, a farm gives you space, and they were pretty well all family or hangers-on, or about to become hangers-on, if you like. And my grandchildren had cut a year's supply of logs that afternoon and enjoyed it, having competitions to see who could split big logs with the least number of swings. Just, men's stuff, but some of the girls joining in as well. Everybody was tired in a good way, but I got there, everybody was chatting away. No, nobody was excluded. There was no bad vibes of any sort, with minimal alcohol to push it along a bit. I just sat down and enjoyed the incredible atmosphere in the house. And of course, the most important thing is how the family grows. And during that weekend, 2 more great-grandchildren had been announced as on the way. So we're up to 6 from 22 grandchildren. That was stunning. Even more stunning, in fact, was one of my grandchildren, when things had calmed down a bit, came and sat next to me and said, "Grandad, I just want to thank you." I said, "What on earth for?" She said, "I took your advice for the first week of university, and I read Psalm 119 slowly, like you said it should be read, and thinking of it as a journey through life, starting with a teenager who says, 'Tell me what to do and I'll do it,' and ending with an old guy like me who in his 80s says, 'Lord, I'm like a lost sheep. I get lost all the while. Have mercy on me.' But the story, of course, is that the mercy is always there." And she said it really helped. It was so beautiful reading it slowly. And she said, I was talking about it to a boy in the class, and I said, "Why don't you go and listen?" And the next day I talked to him, and he said, "I spent all afternoon listening to your grandfather." Now, anybody who said they didn't enjoy that would be lying, wouldn't they? The sense was that it was entirely grace. It was the grace that was giving me that pleasure. And the fact that so far in our family, with the grandchildren well on into the marrying stakes, about a third of the way through, we have no divorce. But the grandchildren's group are going to have a much harder time than I had, or their parents. And that's where Jamaica comes in, which was the next trip. So on the Tuesday after Thanksgiving, I was off to Jamaica for 10 days. For those of you who not listened to this podcast before, I spent 7 years in Jamaica doing research on malnourished children. But over the last 10 or more years, I've been going back once a year to do an opening lecture on the ethical basis of medicine. It's always a lot of fun. I always get a whole bunch of students coming to ask questions after the lecture, and that happened as usual this time. But what was bugging me, of course, is this question of pornography. And it came up several times during the 10 days, but the most striking one was on the last morning, before I was to fly out on the afternoon. during that morning, I spent an hour or more talking to young men who were doing a course to train them for jobs in engineering technology. And they, about 30 of them, I guess, and they were paying attention seriously. When I'd finished, I was talking to 3 or 4 of them, and I asked the question, what proportion of the boys in this class do you think watch pornography on a regular basis? And he said, all of us. That was a stunning thought, and I've only done a little bit of research so far, and some of you listening may know far more and can lead me as to where to go next. But it didn't take long to find out that, yes, addiction to pornography is a major problem across the whole of society, including pastors and priests. This is not good news. The worst part, of course, is that if you're watching really horrible pornography and that turns you on, it's highly unlikely after a little while that you'll be turned on by normal sexuality. That's terrifying. Somebody suggested that might be the reason why Japan's population is declining so rapidly, because they've normalized pornography for 50 years or more. So this is something we need to think about within our own families. I mean, I've talked to you recently about the damage that screens are doing. If those screens also contain pornography, it's even worse. So the case for denying access to screens to children till they've learned to read a book with enjoyment without putting it down, that probably means before the age of 15 or 16, it's serious stuff. Our home and our children have not had free access. We never had a screen at all, not even a television screen, until the youngest was 15 years of age. But none of our children were caught in this, of course, but our grandchildren are. The starting point, as I've said in a previous posting, was 2011, and the arrival of the iPhone, which Jonathan Haidt showed, has totally changed the nature of growing up for young people. And he didn't touch the issue of pornography in his book. I think he is inevitably going to stumble across it if he goes on much further, and I hope he does, because he's so good at it. I don't know where to go on this one, except that I do know this, that this will not be easy to deal with. All addictions are hard to deal with. Nobody can crow about their success in dealing with any addiction, whether it be drugs, alcohol, sex, even food. It's not easy to deal with. It gets into our souls very easily. The only advice I have given to people and subsequently been thanked for was not directly to do with addiction at all, but to do with an ongoing problem for life. And that was when you have to tell a mum that she's got a baby who is going to be a problem for the whole of its life, and that life will probably not exceed 30 years. What do you say under those circumstances? You've got to tell the truth at one level, but you've got to do it with as much compassion as you can muster. Now, one of the best occasions was a mum who somehow we immediately realized we both shared our faith, so we were free to talk about that. And I said to him, look, this is going to be really tough. We'll do everything we can to help you, but it's not going to amount to much. You're going to need some divine help, but you and I both believe that when we ask, we get that help. And I would suggest to you, one thing you could do is go home and copy out the last chapter of Philippians. I think it might help you. Because, of course, in that chapter, Paul is, at the beginning of the chapter, there's a little tiff going on in the church. He tells 2 women to get their act together. But then he talks to the church in general and says, look, you need to lay out your needs to God. You need to tell him about where you're at, and then ask for his help. And the promise is that he will keep your heart and mind in peace. And then, far better than the modern psychologist, he says, now, go and practice good things. And he lists the sorts of things we are to think about, to start taking mind control over in general. Whatever is true, just, pure, honest, of good report. Think about these things, and your mind will be stabilized. And he goes on and says, look, I know what I'm talking about. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. And he is content writing this beautiful epistle, knowing he's going to get his head chopped off in the next few weeks. You can't do better than that. Years later, I met this mum in a social context, and we were talking, and she said, the best advice you ever gave me was to copy out the last chapter of Philippians and put it on the fridge. It got me through time and time again. The power of those words is real, especially when your plea is real. We have lost the battle for being taken seriously because we're not serious. I say to Christians all the while now, you've only got one thing to do. Go and tell what the Lord has done for you. If you've got nothing to say, then you've got some praying to do so that there is something to say, because it can become available to you. During that week in Jamaica, I did multiple talks, but more importantly, I had multiple talks with individuals. And they were deeply moving to me, and I think to them, judging by the emails I've got subsequently. Our world is in trouble, and we as Christians are not even acknowledging that it doesn't bother us as much as it bothers everyone else, because we have divine help. The easiest way to start, I think, is to do two things as a discipline. Say the Lord's Prayer to yourself every morning when you wake up by rote, and then say it a second time and ask God to stop you somewhere, so that in the day when your mind's about to go wandering off into difficult places, you'll have that phrase as a starting point for your mind to go in a different direction. It works. And the other thing is to realize that even Christians, when they get in bad times, which they do, some of the practices of the faith drop away. They don't seem to be working. The last one to drop away is usually the Psalms. And I don't think they'll drop away at all if you come to love them. So I try and read a psalm every day. I don't always do that. But if you read one every day, the Catholics say you should read 3, which is amazing. And other groups say 2. But 1 is as much as I can usually manage, sometimes more. I mean, when it's a little one, I read a couple. But say a column of your Bible as the minimum. Those psalms feed my soul in all sorts of ways. Whether you believe or not, you can relate to the anguish of the people writing, and you can see that they find some peace for their anguish, not always, but sometimes. It's poetry. It has to be read as poetry. The best book that I have found the Psalms to help me read is not by a theologian. I mean, he's theologically competent, but he was a professor of English and classics in New Zealand, Blakelock. He wrote 2 volumes on the Psalms, which are hard to find. You can still find them. I don't know that they're actually in print. You probably have to go to a second-hand book supply. That's the book Blakelock, Commentary on the Psalms, Volumes 1 and 2. They are stunning, just as Psalm 119 helped my granddaughter. Psalm 73, for instance, is an ideal psalm for a student just starting university, because it's written in flashback, but it shows the way life runs, when underneath there are 2 things. Growing up in a culture that respects other people, you love other people, you have groups of people that you would not want to upset under any circumstances. And when this old man looks back, he says, when I was a young man, I nearly lost it, because I began to be envious of the success of others. What stopped him was, I can't say that, it would break so many people's hearts. And it's not till 2/3 of the way through the psalm that he finds his solution. And he finds it, of course, in worship. And he says, then I understood that they, the ones of whom I was envious, have their feet in slippery places. They do not have outcomes in their lives which anyone would want. All that I need can be found in you, O Lord. I was an ignorant fool, but thank you. And I know that afterwards you will take me to glory. He found his way through life. He's writing looking back. But in order to use the Psalms well, you need to have read them so that you know where to go on a bad day. I usually say there's even a verse for the middle of residency. I changed just one word, but it's in Psalm 119. No, it's not. Or maybe it is. Yeah, it's verse 76, probably Psalm 119, but I think of it as residency. And he's basically saying this: I have become like a dried up old wineskin in the smoke. When, O Lord, will you punish those attendings who are punishing me? That's how you feel at one stage. You're working your butt off and you don't always get help. Sometimes you get unjustified criticism, not an easy time. But there it is, right in the middle of that psalm. And if you know where it is, it can bring a brief smile to your face as you realize I'm not alone. This has happened throughout life. I'm encouraging you to put some structure into your lives, because one of the things that is clear is that the structures are falling away. The other woman who, I've read a couple of her things now, and I will read some more, Freya India, who has a Substack site called Girls. But she has written about the emptiness of their lives, and I think that is generally true, that their lives have been flattened out. I mean, anybody under the age of 25 has no metaphysical content to their life, as far as I can see, hardly able to join a conversation at that level. That is absolutely terrifying. How are they going to cope? I don't know how they're going to. What we should be doing, and we aren't, we're not providing a sufficiently attractive alternative, because we have dumbed down our worship almost to a social club, somewhere where we go with people who share our views to sort of stroke one another and feel a bit better on Sunday, or perhaps twice a week if you're lucky. But there needs to be a lot more depth to it, more work put into it. And when that happens, the world will see what should happen to you, especially when you're in the training positions of your life, is that at some point somebody ought to come and say to you, look, you cope with these things in a much better way than I do. What's your secret? That's what should happen. It's just not happening enough. One of the things that started me off on this amazing trail for the last quarter of my life, although I don't know how long it's going to go on, so it might be more than a quarter. We'll see. But what got to me was students, of course, as always. And they were the ones who said, look, you claim to know things we don't know and ought to know. Will you teach us? And so I started teaching an Agnostics Anonymous group. The only prerequisite was that you couldn't claim to be a Christian. And it was really good to see how, even back then when I started, I don't know, somewhere in the 80s, how much they enjoyed engaging with topics that are not discussed. I mean, we started bringing ethics programs in, as I've discussed before, but ethics programs taught without any metaphysical depth are utterly useless. It's not an accident that medicine as we know it grew out of the Judeo-Christian world over a very long period of time, going right back to the 6th century with Benedict starting the monasteries, which became the model in a way for, first of all, just caring for the elderly and the sick and the bereft. We didn't have any effective treatment until the 1860s. I mean, it wasn't until the 1860s that going to the doctor correlated with living longer. You can think about that. I'm trying to get you to respond to me. Some of you do, but I'd like to hear from a lot more. I found the most effective way to begin to unpack the aspects of life that were lost was to modify a talk I first heard from amazing Jesuit Father Robert Spitzer, who must be in the top 10 brightest guys in North America. I gather he's getting old and blind now, and I haven't been in touch with him for a while. I should try to do that. We did actually get a book on the 4 levels of happiness, which I'm going to say something about now, which was dedicated to 2 of us, much to my delight, and his by right and mine by pure happenstance. But sitting on a plane, for instance, someone sits next to you, or you sit next to someone else, you say good morning, good afternoon. If they're in the mood to speak, they'll say a few words, and you usually ask where you're going, where you're coming from, what you do. And when I get asked that question, I say, well, a bit difficult. I talk about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy because I believe if you don't bring those 4 things together on the same page, no society can last for long. It will fall apart, as we are seeing in various places around the world. No ethical depth, no longevity of the society. You can talk about it most easily by discussing happiness. And they almost invariably say, what do you mean? I say, well, this is a dangerous talk, so it can change your life. So if you say stop, I will. You can stop me and say, I think I've had enough, that's it, I won't say another word about that. But that's never happened. No one said stop. And I don't know. I've done a lot of flying over the years. There must be hundreds of people who've had this conversation. Now, the first thing is to recognize it way back to the Greeks. People understood that you could think about happiness at least in 4 layers. And the bottom layer, the one that we all have in common, we share with the animals. I call it animal happiness. Robert Spitzer has nice Greek names for these, but the only problem is for the 99% of the population, Greek names are not memorable. But you go back to him for a more in-depth discussion of this. But animal happiness is a happiness that many students are indulging in, and in so doing becoming more like animals and less like human beings. So we don't have any cattle on the farm at the moment, but for 20 years we had a bunch of Herefords who were grass-fed, and therefore a niche market for a guy who'd had his heart attack because there's no interfiber fat on grass-fed cows. Now, those cows some of them went to market well over £2,000, so they could push down any fence, but they never did. Those cows were perfectly happy as long as they had water, food, and a very occasional bull. That was it. And they had no problem about having sex in public or anything else in public, come to that. And when the end came, if it came, they died much better than we do because they had no angst. That's animal happiness. But we can destroy things that the animals don't destroy. They don't abuse food in their natural state. It's only when we give them food they shouldn't be having that happens. And they don't abuse sex. We abuse both. I've spent many hours of my life talking to anorexic and obese children, both of which are very difficult things to deal with effectively. I've also seen a lot of suicide amongst my compatriots because doctors commit suicide a lot because they have no depth to their lives, even if they don't have serious depression as the cause, which is usually what is a prelude to suicide. But some of them just fall out of life. It's not good. So the only thing you can do when you get to unhappiness 1, if happiness 1 is good sex and good food and good animal things, unhappiness 1 is when you abuse those things and they all turn bad on you. Instead of being happiness, they're unhappiness. You can't maintain relationships, you can't keep your body in shape, etc. The only thing to do now is to go up a notch, which is what Socrates wanted us to do when we went to university. He thought that if we taught people well, they would become wise and able to deal with life better. But of course, in the modern university, I routinely ask students in conversation, Have you ever left a class and said to yourself, I'm wiser than I was at the beginning? I've yet to have anyone say yes in the recent past, although I can remember, and most of my age group can remember, people who taught us in a way that was permanent at the metaphysical level. That's what happiness, too, should be, growing a life that is good, learning how to live a good life, becoming wise. The trouble is that they don't get to that. Within no time flat, students arriving in university are deeply anxious about what's happening. They're terrified of failing. We have to have profs who are sort of like Catholic priests. You can go to them and say, look, I'm so anxious, I've been abusing drugs and alcohol and sex, and I need help. And they get help without it appearing in a transcript. But it's not easy to help because they don't have a narrative of life that's rich enough to take them through these things. So unhappiness, too, is basically anxiety and its various associates. And the only way out of it now is to go up another step, which is to begin to realize that some activities are intrinsically good, worthwhile. The most striking one for most people until relatively recently was having your own children. They do things to you from the moment you get pregnant. It's not just having the baby. That's, if you let someone else do that for you, you missed out on a lot. But they take your life over. They have no idea, and they also have no idea how much pleasure they can give you as they begin to be people that you're fond of and proud of. You do it without any expectance of payment in the usual sense, but you're paid in the much better sense, as I had coming home to find 41 people who liked one another in our house and listening to conversations that were good, that were kind, that were caring. The best thing I ever did with students was to take them with me to Africa and dump them in a village 2 days' walk from the road and leave them there to do a health survey of the village for 5 weeks. And I didn't stay with them. I'd come back once to see they were surviving and then go back to pick them up at the end. They all said afterwards they were glad that they'd done it. Some said, I will never do anything like that again. Some couldn't wait to get back because they began to see, the savages aren't as noble as Rousseau would have you say, so to speak, but we're the savages in many ways now. There are relationships in African villages that we don't have anymore. We've become so isolated. So, but it's a need to be needed love. It comes to an end. The children grow up and go away, and sometimes they don't come back to see you. This is sadness. If you have vested your life in happiness 3, doing things, retirement is incredibly hard to handle. Children growing up is the emptiness syndrome, incredibly hard to handle. The only way out now is to go back to a deeper source of life, happiness 4. Now, if I'm on an airplane, I don't make this explicit. I just want to put some seeds in the ground and I hope that they flourish. And I say, well, look, I just need to tell you a few happiness 4 stories and you'll get the message. I always use one from, I'd like to call her a colleague, but we only met a couple of times, but we're on the same page, Diane Comp. She, like me, grew up in a Christian home. Both of us allowed the faith to drift away during the early part of the medical career. I came back more swiftly than she did, but what you get from those sorts of Christian homes is ideas of duty and responsibility, which you take seriously. To be brought up in such a home is an incredible gift, and one should always be grateful for it. And she was very smart, and I don't think she'd mind me saying that she intimidated the men, so she wasn't going to get asked out. In fact, she doubted whether she'd marry, and I don't think she did. But she loved children, so she did pediatrics. Rather, what's the word I want? it was a good fortune for her, but it wouldn't have been a wise choice from a practical point of view. She got into oncology, ran the oncology program for children in Yale. Now, the problem with that is that there's a significant death rate to serious cancer, leukemias and the like. And she had become a person who believed that life had no ultimate meaning. That's not easy to deal with. So she dealt with it in the way the doctors often do. When you have something you can't deal with, you let someone else do it. In this case, the social workers. But her mother would turn up at the back of her head and say, Diana, I didn't bring you up to desert children you love when they need you at the end. You ought to be there. And in the end, she gave in, of course. The first child she sat with was a little girl of 8, dying of leukemia, with Mom and Dad and our still chaplain and Diane sitting by the bed. Then, just before she died, she sat up. Lucid intervals are not rare when children die. It's as though they wake up and say goodbye. But she said goodbye in a wonderful way. She said, Mummy, can you see the angels? Can you hear them singing? It's beautiful. And she was gone. Now, if you don't tear up a little bit, you've got a swinging brick for a heart. Now, Mum and Dad turned out to be Christian, of course, and that was a huge help with their grieving. The hospital chaplain actually couldn't handle it. He ran away. He'd only got Psychology 101, and that wasn't adequate. And Diane was a tough lady. She didn't give in, but she knew that she had witnessed something which was not a psychological quirk. It was real. I won't spoil the book for you. It took 3 more children to bring her back to faith. I'll just tell you that, as she says herself, I was an arrogant Yale professor. So God used a little guy with an IQ of 80 to bring me to my knees. And I'll leave you to get the book and weep over that story. If you don't, I don't think there's any hope for you. It's called A Window on Heaven by Diane Comp, and it's published by HarperCollins. So, easy to find. Now, I have Happiness 4 stories. We all should have them. I'm not going to labour this point at the moment. My usual time is almost up, but I want to say a little bit more about what we need to do if we're going to get a deepening of life again amongst students. I think home and Christian schools and charter schools are moving in this direction, and there's no question that they're producing happier children and better educated children. So the Ivy Leagues break their own rules to let them in. Militant atheists, instead of asking parents what they would like, are demanding that we be religiously neutral. But neutrality is not possible. Moral neutrality is not possible, because some things are intrinsically moral decisions. They need to recognize that secularism is a belief system, and it can't answer the big questions. So I want to leave you with the big questions, especially some of you who perhaps had bad experiences in church along the way. This is in a talk called The Myth of Moral Neutrality, which I wrote many years ago. But the first time I gave it was at McGill, and afterwards I finished the talk by saying, look, you're going into medicine, and the bottom line is there's some questions that everybody has to answer either by default or, better still, by serious thought before the end of their lives. There are 9 of them. We don't know who wrote them. And there are multiple variants on these themes, but the 9 that make easy, memorable sense are these. Everybody needs to ask the question, where did I come from? Now, that particular question in the 19th century was answered by Darwin. You came from meaningless chance. That's now dead. I mean, it'll take 20 years to disappear from high school textbooks, but the probability of DNA, particularly with the double reading frame, happening by chance is 0. 1 for all the molecules in the cosmos, I think, is what John Lennox has calculated. It's a not too serious calculation, but it makes the point. Similarly, in 50 years of attempting to get an organic molecule from an inorganic start, is impossible. And James Tour is the person to go and look out for that. So those two areas, scientists are those areas. If they're not going to attack Christianity, they just don't want to talk about it. And of course, in physics and quantum physics and cosmology, the same things are happening. I always forget the name of the guy. He was head of the Humanist Society, a very well-known physicist, but he said something like this. He said, the maker's aim, it appears to me, had to be accurate to one part, raised to the power 10, raised to the power of 137 zeros before you get to the probability of a win. Now, that's not going to happen. That's his view of the conditions that were necessary for us to get where we are now. So that's where did I come from. Why am I here? We all feel obligated, and in simpler rural societies, those feelings have been nurtured through generations. Now, we're moving to a tribal world. We were tribal too, but it was a tribal world where one of the things that you did was to help anybody who needed help. You still see that in the Christian. I've got my tractor stuck in the mud on my farm on more than one occasion where my neighbour saw that I'd got stuck and he was there in 10 minutes without being asked. That's the world we live in. And my brother-in-law lived down the road from us, and when they sold their house, they had to search for the keys because they hadn't locked the door in 25 years. That still happens in rural America. It wouldn't happen in many places in the world. In fact, I don't know of any other places in the world where that happens, except ones with a Judeo-Christian base that's really alive. What ought I to do? In the way we used to be brought up, it was put into our lives by the stories we heard in Sunday school. Of course, Sunday school is failing everywhere, because when I was a kid, Sunday school was actually the most enjoyable form of Sunday afternoon for most kids. They sang some happy songs, they were taught stories, they were encouraged, and those stories were all morally consequential. That's the point about the Bible. Nobody gets away with anything, so you learn moral consequence. If you do this, that will happen. If you do that, something else will happen. The heart of Judaism. Oh, that they would keep this law, that it might go well with them and their children forever. But they won't, and they will lose their way, which they have done multiple times. All humans do. But there is a way to answer the questions, what ought I to do? So, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Is there anything after death? To believe that there is nothing is an act of faith with precious little evidence. To believe that there is something, there's quite a lot of evidence, and you should take it seriously. So that brings to the next more practical trio, which is death, suffering, and justice. Can you give an account of human existence which makes sense of death, provides a space for dealing with suffering, and can believe that there is such a thing as justice, which must, in part at least, be delayed? And then the last three, what can I know so that I may know what I ought to do, ought to believe, so that I may know what I ought to believe? Knowledge that leads to doing, which leads to faith. I hope you find this helpful.